Produce Falcha Riv Gagdanyan Shaw. Thank you very much for being here, and everybody's welcome. It's absolutely brilliant to see such a large group of people here interested to hear the stories which are going to be told here today. We have quite a few speakers ready and willing to let us know stuff that we think we know already, and I can't wait to hear what the information that's going to be served out to us here today. So look, without much more from me, the first speaker up here will be Pat Sheegan, who is our local MLA and our spokesperson for issues relating to the Palestinian people. Gurmagat, Pat.
Gurmai Ogov agus Farina Falcha, Rua Valeganshaw, and you. My job today is to sort of draw parallels between our prison struggle in the 70s and 80s and what's happening to Palestinian prisoners at the minute, and how struggles within prison can become very heavily politicised and can actually be the front line of the struggle on some occasions. But first of all, I just want to talk about the situation in Palestine and the Middle East at the minute. There was supposedly a ceasefire between the Israelis and Hamas quite a few months ago. As everyone knows, the Israelis haven't upheld their part of the bargain. That there are still people being killed in Gaza every day. And on top of that, settlers are still moving in, terrorising Palestinian families in the West Bank and colonising land in the West Bank. So in the middle of all that's happening right across the Middle East, the Israelis are still continuing to do what they have always been doing, which is to terrorise and oppress the Palestinian people, whether they're in the West Bank or in Gaza or East Jerusalem or wherever. But what I'm here for today is to talk about prison struggle. And there are thousands of Palestinians in prison at the minute. Many children are in prison. Hundreds of children are in prison. Thousands of people are detained under what the Israelis called administrative detention. We know that better as internment here. What it means is that people are taken from their homes and thrown into prison without any due process. There's no charges, there are no courts, nothing at all. And many thousands of others are in on, as we knew here, on trumped up charges, on tortured and forced to make confessions, and so on. And that's the situation there at the minute. It's an absolutely brutal regime, a brutal regime. And we have heard of instances of prisoners being raped. One prisoner was raped with the muzzle of an M16 rifle was forced into his back passage and caused damage, obviously, to his intestines and so on. And he died not long after that in hospital. Another prisoner had a fire extinguisher forced into his back passage, and the fire extinguisher was put on. He also died. So that's the level of abuse and torture that we're talking about. And I've seen reports recently that Marwan Barghouti, who would be seen as one of the leaders of the Palestinian prisoners and a well-known leader of the Palestinian struggle over many years, who's been in prison for a very long time now, that he was very badly beaten and assaulted over the last couple of months. And some of you may have seen the footage not that long ago when Ben Gvir went into the prison and tried to humiliate Marwan Barghouti. But I'm just telling those stories to convey to you the level of brutality and torture that exists within the Israeli prison system for Palestinian prisoners. And then, of course, just over a week ago, we had the Israeli Parliament introducing a new law which would allow the Israelis to execute Palestinian prisoners. Not Israelis, just Palestinians. And Kieran McAvoy is going to go into more detail on that when he is speaking. And that's the reality of prison life for Palestinian prisoners. And many of us here are ex-prisoners who went through the cages, the H blocks, and so on. And we also experienced torture and brutality while we were in prison. So if anyone can empathise with what Palestinian prisoners are going through, it's the people here, and not just the men and women who were in the H blocks in Armagh and so on, and in other prisons over in England and even down south, but our families as well, because our families know what we were going through. They know the trauma that many prisoners experienced while they were in prison, and many prisoners still experiencing that trauma from as a result of what they went through in the prisons. But really, we're not here to talk about that today. We want to look forward a bit. We want to draw parallels between how prisoners can get involved in political struggle. And while we were particularly in the H blocks, when the British introduced their criminalisation policy, it was an attempt to defeat our struggle, because they thought if they could get the prisoners to accept criminalisation, to accept that they were criminals, that our struggle was criminal in nature, that it would have such a demoralising effect on others involved in the struggle and our supporters, that the British thought they would be able to detach Republicans from the communities from which they came and in which they operated. And the British saw the prisoners as the soft underbelly of the struggle. They thought if they could break the prisoners, then they could move on and break the whole struggle. And in a sense, you know, that's the belief of the Israelis as well. They think if they can humiliate and beat and defeat and cow political prisoners in their jails, that will have a demoralising impact on the Palestinian resistance overall. So what was important to us at the time, not just resistance within the prison, but an understanding both within the prison and on the outside of the prison, that we needed to internationalise the struggle here, and not just the struggle on the outside, but with a particular spotlight on what was happening within the prisons. And those of us who are old enough to remember the early days of the blanket protests from 1976 on, probably up until 1978, the protest received very little coverage, apart from within, you know, Republican circles and full-block Republican news, places like that. It didn't get much traction in the mainstream media. And I remember, and it was probably around 1977, I happened to be talking to an SDLP councillor, and I said to her that the SDLP needed to take up a position on what was happening in the prisons, because it was going to develop into a big issue. And her response at the time was that they didn't think that. They thought it was a sort of niche issue at the time, and they didn't need to get involved in it. And if you think about it, that's the mindset that brought the SDLP to where they are now, very much on the periphery, that they didn't see, they didn't understand the history of prisoner resistance down through the centuries. This wasn't just a new phenomenon of the 1970s. This is prisoner resistance to attempts by the British to break them or to criminalise them has been going on for centuries. So that was the context of what was happening within the H blocks. And I suppose, you know, a lot of things happened serendipitously, although part of our strategy within the blocks, and I use strategy in very loose terms because in many ways we were reacting to what was happening within the H blocks at the time. As the prison regime turned the screw on us more and more, then we intensified our protests. So it went from just being in a cell naked with a blanket around us. It then turned into, as the brutality increased, it turned into the no wash protest. You know, we started putting our own excrement on the wall because to get out to use the toilets, because there were no toilets in the cell. That was when you were more likely to get a beating, to be brutalised, to be subject to very degrading searches and so on. So all of that was happening. And then, of course, the hunger strike of 1980 really then shone a spotlight on what was happening. And that had been preceded by Cardinal O'Fake visiting the blocks and receiving massive publicity in regard to what he said about the situation in the prisons, that, you know, he couldn't believe even animals would be kept in that situation, and he'd seen nothing like it except in the sewers of Calcutta. So that was the situation, and then we moved on to the hunger strike of 1980, which, you know, the British actually thought was the zenith, the high point of the prisoners' resistance, and thought that after that, you know, the game was over, that they had won, and so on. But of course, again, they underestimated and didn't take account of the mentality and the mindset of prisoners and where we drew our inspiration from. You know, from the McSweeneys, the Thomas Ashes, the two lads who died in prison in England in the 70s on hunger strike, Stagg and Gahan. You know, those were the people we looked up to. Those were the people that we drew inspiration from. And, you know, we were never going to bend the knee to the Brits. And we had a great leader in Bobby Sands, who decided that he would lead a second hunger strike. And the serendipity I'm talking about was when the MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone died suddenly, and it was decided that we would stand Bobby as a candidate in that election in Fermanagh South Tyrone. And, you know, for young people now, it seems like taking part in elections and so on is just normal. But back in the day, Republicans were opposed to any sort of electoral process for many reasons. One, because, I mean, the state was established on the basis of a gerrymandered sectarian head count. So the game was rigged against us. And many people believe that by entering electoral politics, you have to compromise on your core principles. But after a major discussion within the movement, it was decided to stand Bobby. And of course, we know that Bobby won that election. Thatcher had said beforehand, the prisoners have no support, the IRA have no support, and Bobby's election blew that assertion completely out of the water. So that was the situation we were in. And you know, in my view, the day Bobby Sands was elected was the day criminalisation ended. And as time went on, the inspiration of the hunger strikers brought more and more people into the movement and into the struggle. And eventually, you know, we came to a situation where the British realised they had tried everything and they had failed to defeat the Republican struggle. So the only option left to them was negotiation. And that was where we ended up. And in my view, you know, the seeds of the process and where we are today in terms of coming closer to United Ireland were sown in the H blocks back in 1981. But how does all that connect to the situation with the Palestinian prisoners? And I suppose in the fog of war and all that's happening, you know, the genocide that's taken place, the massacre of thousands of people, whether it's in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran or wherever, it's hard to put a spotlight on the prisoners, because when there's a genocide happening, I mean, who is really focused on prisoners being ill-treated and so on? The genocide is a much bigger issue that needs to be ended. So, but at some stage, this genocide is going to end. That's not to say that the causes of the political problems in Palestine are going to be resolved. The Israelis are still going to be occupying that land, and they're still going to be oppressing Palestinians and trying to drive them out. What we need to do, all of us, in conjunction with the Palestinians and with other people who support the Palestinian cause, is to start thinking now about a campaign around political prisoners in Palestine and what we can do to shine a spotlight on what is happening there. Because the legitimacy of any state is undermined by what they do to the most vulnerable in their society. And the legitimacy of the Israeli state and the Israeli regime, of course, has been undermined by the genocide and so on. But the fear is that when the genocide ends and we go back to the sort of low-level genocide that has been happening, you know, since 1947, 48, that the world will take their eyes off what is happening. And what we need to be ready for is when that situation arises, that we continue on with the struggle. We bring focus onto the issue of Palestinian prisoners, along with other issues such as the BDS. And the BDS campaign is really biting. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You see more and more big companies divesting from Israeli companies. You see more and more people refusing to buy Israeli goods and so on. So there are many strands to the struggle, not just for Palestinian prisoners. And I mean, the big issue in terms of Palestinian prisoners is about getting Palestinian prisoners released in the first place. And that there should be some sort of comprehensive peace agreement in the way there was here that would see all Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails. But in the meantime, we need to start thinking about a campaign now and working in conjunction with the Palestinian support organisations, not just here, but across Europe, and with the Palestinians themselves, and find out from them what we can do. What can we do to shine a light on what's happening with the Palestinian prisoners? Because as we found out, you know, between probably 1976 and 1981, the prisoners were in the front line of the struggle as well. We made massive advances in our struggle because of what was happening in the H blocks. And there's no reason why the same situation can't develop among the Palestinian prisoners. So I don't have answers for people. I don't have a strategy. I'm throwing those suggestions out there for people to think about, because at some time, at some stage, the ferocity of what has been happening will ease off, and some people will start to forget about the Middle East and think everything has been sorted and so on. Those of us who are activists in the Palestinian cause need to keep our focus on what's happening, particularly with the prisoners. Sinead, Cormac.
Okay, Cormac, Pat, for that comparative there with the Irish political and Palestinian political prisoners. The next person we'll have up here is Kieran McAvoy, Professor Kieran McAvoy from the Professor of Law at Queen's University and Transitional Justice, who's going to further elaborate for us. Okay, Kieran McAvoy.
Thank you to Mickey and Pater for the invite, and it's an honour and a privilege to be here. I want to start off, which is unusual for an academic, by emphasising my lack of credentials to do this particular talk. So Pater saw me and Sean Murray do a couple of gigs on Irish political imprisonment, and in particular around criminalisation. And Sean was speaking obviously from his perspective as an insider, and I was speaking as an academic who's done some work on political prisoners here. And then Pater came up to me afterwards and says, have you ever been to Palestine? I said, well, yeah, I've been like 6 or 7 times, you know. And he says, right, we have a thing on coming up in the Fens. Would you come and talk about Palestinian political prisoners? And I said, Pater, I am not an expert on Palestinian political prisoners. And he said, so, well, you've been there 5 or 6 times and you know a bit about it. You sound like an expert to me. So I am stressing again, I've already had this conversation with the ambassador. If there are technical questions that I just don't know, I will put my hands up and say I don't know, and I will rely on the ambassador to help me out. So I know quite a lot of people in this room, but for those of you who don't know me, my background is I started off as working for nIarchimí, actually, which is a big charity organisation here. I was their information research officer just out of college in my early 20s. And one of the first big pieces of work that I worked on in there was actually on the release of political prisoners as part of conflict transformation. This was in 1993-94, and at that stage we were looking to Palestine and Israel as the examples, the good examples in the Oslo period of how to make peace. And so myself and my boss Brian Gormley put together a project where we went to a number of countries where prisoners had been released as part of a peace process to see what we could learn and to feed that into the process and into the negotiations around the Good Friday Agreement. I did my PhD was on political prisoners here, both in terms of strategies of resistance deployed by prisoners, primarily Republicans, but also on the strategies that the state engaged in trying to manage, or indeed, as Pat said, break the prisoners at different stages. I did a book on that, and more recently, the last time I was in Palestine, I was looking. I did something here called "What Did the Lawyers Do During the War?" So I am a lawyer, and I was interested in exploring what role lawyers played here as not just technical actors, but as legal, political and moral actors during the conflict. And then we put together a project where we looked at how lawyers performed similar functions in other contexts, and we were in Palestine and in Israel around that. So I've interviewed Palestinian political prisoners about their relationships with their lawyers, as well as talking to Palestinian and Israeli lawyers representing political prisoners about how they work within. So in this talk I'll probably put a bit more detail on some of the stuff that Pat was talking about in terms of the architecture of repression that the Israelis deploy, and in many ways the lack of space for legal resistance. It's a very difficult place to find space for creative legal resistance. I've supervised a couple of PhDs on Palestinian political imprisonment, and I'll draw a little bit on that. So in effect I'm ripping off the work of some of my own students, because what happened was when they came, because I had worked on political imprisonment, they wanted to write about Palestinian political imprisonment. So I was saying, okay, you need to understand what happened in Ireland and then see the lessons that can be drawn. They're not exact, they're not parallel, of course, but there are obviously some themes, and I'll pull out some of those themes. And I'll do a bit on the death penalty, as Pat said as well, given how topical it is. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the thing, there are a lot of competing figures on this, but at least 800,000 Palestinian prisoners have been imprisoned since 1967. I mean, just think about that figure for a moment. 800,000. Currently, there's at least 11,000 prisoners in Israeli prisons. They include 60 women, 350 children, as Pat said. There are undisclosed numbers, thousands, of prisoners held in Israeli military camps. It's very difficult. I've been going through all the NGO stuff. It's actually very difficult to get accurate statistics as to how many of these prisoners who are classified as unlawful combatants, and I'll come back to that. Many prisoners are processed in the Israeli system by military courts, military judges. I interviewed a couple of military judges, and I raised the point with one military judge. I said, look, there's a 99% conviction rate in your courts. Does that not give you pause for concern at all? And he said, no, I think that means we're doing our job well. I was thinking, really? Like 99% conviction rate? In effect, what happens in the military court system, when the interviews we were doing with Palestinian and Israeli human rights lawyers, is that there's a lot of plea bargaining. In effect, there's a lot of negotiations down because, and you can totally understand it, the prisoners know you have no chance of getting justice. So would you fight if you know you have a 1% chance of actually getting justice in this system? So of course people are going to involve in negotiations around sentence and so forth, and it suits the Israeli system because in effect it becomes a conveyor belt, because people are involved in negotiations, plea bargaining, and so forth, because you're not going to get justice. The experience of political imprisonment is like in many working class Republican areas, just a normalised feature of community and family life. I've seen one figure which suggests, I think, 40%, at least 40% of Palestinian families have had a direct family member in prison. It's just a normal part of Palestinian life, people who've served prisons. There's 1,500 sentenced prisoners in the system. There's about 3,500 currently awaiting trial. And I'll come back to this, but the prison system is underpinned by widespread abuse, torture, sexual violence, as Pat was talking about, starvation, lack of medical treatment for prisoners, and the systemic nature of the human rights violations within the Israeli prison system has been amplified since October 7th. It was already pretty bad, but it has got significantly worse. So just to give you a sense of the architecture of how it works, so as Pat said, the administrative detention orders, which is what we all would understand as internment, and of course bear in mind that the British legal tradition, so the Israeli legal system, is drawn from the Palestinian Mandate period, which is British law, and of course internment was mapped into that, so it's baked in to the legal architecture of oppression, drawing from the experience of the British. So the internment system, the administrative detention order, primarily is used against Palestinians in the West Bank. Evidence, inverted commas, big inverted commas, is submitted to military judges. Often the lawyers can't challenge the evidence. You will have people giving evidence, the old trick, evidence behind the screen. I honestly believe that X person is a member of X armed group, and so forth. Very difficult for lawyers to find creative ways of challenging that. It has a curious veneer of legality to it. It has a veneer of legality. We tried to get into the military courts and they wouldn't let us in, actually. We tried to negotiate. I wanted to see how they worked in practice, and we were involved in extensive negotiations trying to get in. In the end, they wouldn't let us in. So I didn't see it in action, but I interviewed prisoners and lawyers about the experience of how the thing worked in practice. And then they have this other thing, which is called the unlawful combatant law. So you bear in mind, they already had a very repressive architecture of internment, but that was not enough. So they needed a new, different architecture, and that came about under the unlawful combatant law, in which much of the veneer of legality that is characterised by the internment system is simply removed. Right? Now, this was introduced in 2002, and it was, in effect, it was used at the time to facilitate arresting large numbers of people. It was around the conflict with Lebanon, actually, and they were pretty explicit. I looked at the archives on it. They were pretty explicit at the time that these would be used as bargaining chips. that people who were arrested on no evidence or very thin evidence could then be used as bargaining chips in the Lebanese conflict at that juncture, in return for Israeli soldiers, or indeed the bodies of Israelis who'd been killed in action. They were pretty explicit that that's what they were doing. That they were using arresting people to be used as bargaining chips. So in this system, the law states first that there is a presumption that the release of an unlawful combatant will harm state security unless the person can prove otherwise. Right? It's like for lawyers, it's just like it reverses everything intuitively. It's like it is up to you to prove that you are not a threat to Israeli national security. And then secondly, the Ministry of Defence determines that you are affiliated with a particular armed group, and that if the Ministry of Defence make that determination, you cannot be released while that armed group is still involved in hostile actions against the Israeli state. And it's the Ministry of Defence that makes the determination around all of that. Okay. In effect, this is a legalistic version of hostage taking. That's what it is. It's a crude, legalistic way of something akin to taking hostages for political purposes, and that's what it looks like. Now, everybody in this room knows this stuff very well. I'm going to skip through it very quickly. I actually want to focus more on the law stuff. So there's been people in this room have lived this experience, and there's been some excellent stuff written on it, not least by Lawrence McKeown and other ex-political prisoners. The different resistance strategies that Republicans were engaged in. Obviously, it was a communal experience of imprisonment, as Pat was talking about. Republican prisoners in particular were engaged in escape, seeing escape as a responsibility as a POW, and were involved in the No Wash and the Hunger Strike. There was huge emphasis, particularly moving after that period, for the prisoners to gain greater control of the prison space, in use of riots, use of violence inside and outside the prisons. One of the things that always interested me, in particular as a lawyer, was the change in Republican attitudes towards law. And so in the early 70s, as many of you will know, there was a line from the Republican movement that people should not recognise the court. And so in effect, law at that stage is turning into a symbolic arena of struggle, where you are using your non-recognition of the court in order to say, that this is the concrete manifestation of the British presence in Ireland. I will not recognise. But that was a self-defeating strategy in many ways, because people were getting convicted on very thin evidence, and I think there was discussions within the movement at the time and with the lawyers represented, who were respected, I think, by the movement, to say people should be fighting their case here, because actually people are being, it's not helping for people to go in. So anyway, I was very interested in that, in changes in Republican attitudes towards law, away from seeing law simply as an attitude, as a place of symbolic struggle, to seeing law to becoming a tool of practical struggle. And so that manifested itself in two ways, as many people here will know. One, in terms of a series of legal challenges that were taken around the ways in which councils operated, and efforts to exclude Sinn Féin from councils, and there were some really interesting judicial reviews taken at that stage. Judicial review had just come in from 79 onwards, where courts were more willing to look at administrative actions, and administrative actions means in public law both what's happening in the councils. So if you remember, the Unionists were involved in a process of creating little subcommittees to get the business done in councils and excluding Republicans from them, and Republicans won a number of very high profile cases saying that was unlawful and undemocratic. But the other thing that was interesting as well for me at the time was exploring the ways in which Republican prisoners began to use judicial review itself and law to dismantle the disciplinary apparatus within the prisons. So anyway, what you're seeing there is law being turned from simply just seen as either the instrument of the state's repression or a site of symbolic struggle, to seeing actually law itself it can be transformed, can be used. And so anyway, that I was always, and this, I love this phrase. So I also, when I was doing the PhD, which became the book, I interviewed staff and senior governors as well. And so one very reflective governor was talking about his experience of, I'm asking him, how did Republicans manage to gain so much control over the space within the H blocks? How did that happen? And so we went through all of that stuff above, here's all the strategies. And then he said, and there was this other thing, Kieran, which was the tyranny of reasoned argument, right? He said, they're just really good negotiators. And they would just negotiate and negotiate and negotiate. And it was like, eventually it would wear you down. You know? So anyway, I thought that's really very interesting, actually, you know, as a strategy of resistance. So, as I say, ripping off other people's work, which is what I'm doing in this next slide. There's a thing, by the way, folks. So those are the if you want to take anybody who's interested, a photograph of that slide. So I've read 3 of those books. The edited collection, One Threat, I haven't actually read. When you look at what Palestinian prisoners have done, very similar strategies in effect of resistance. So collective organisation, riots, attempting to disrupt the operations of the prison, using education as a tool of struggle, and further politicisation. So particularly if people have been imprisoned at a younger age, might not be fully politicised, seeing the prison experience as part of the political education programme. And so certainly the prisoners that I've interviewed over the years have talked about that. There's been a long, long tradition of hunger strikes going back to 68. And at times you would have Palestinian hunger strikes with thousands of prisoners on hunger strike at the same time. So mass hunger striking, basically, as a strategy. There is in the 2 books that I was involved in supervising, you see in the post-Intifada period, individualised hunger strikes rather than collective organised ones, and there's a whole debate about whether or not that's an effective tool of resistance or not, if things aren't coordinated properly, if people are hunger striking on their own, and so forth. So big discussions around that. Prisoner releases have obviously been an important part of all of this. So the Israelis inevitably use prisoner releases as negotiation, and so prisoners were released as part of the Oslo Accords, and then they went back up. And there is a huge, huge emphasis within the Palestinian community, the ambassador knows this much better than I, around mobilising on behalf of prisoners and their rights. Palestinian Authority have a whole governmental department that is there to provide services to both imprisoned and released prisoners and their families. So it's a huge architectural bit of Palestinian political and social life. The prisoners are the part of the architecture of Palestine itself. So one of the interesting things that has happened in the Israeli context, it has always been characterised by torture, by human rights violations. The prisons have always had that sort of baked in. But as the UN Special Rapporteur in the Occupied Territories, Francesca Albanese, has talked about, what once operated in the shadows is now practised openly. A regime of organised humiliation, pain and degradation, sanctioned at the highest political levels. It has become a laboratory of calculated cruelty. Right? That's a UN Special Rapporteur. As I did in preparation for this talk, when you go in, I'm very used to reading UN reports and stuff, and the language is always very bureaucratic and when you read the language that comes from the UN itself, it's incredibly strong language. It is beyond, like, people are just obviously morally outraged within the UN system when they see what the Israelis have got up to. So it breaks with that sort of tradition of very bureaucratic or legalistic language. There's a strong sense from many reports, including in 2025 and in 2026, from the Commission on Human Rights, very strong language about exactly what the Israelis are up to. Torture has become a state doctrine. Right? Pat's already reflected on this, but I think it's worth just spending a second on it. So in August 2025, the National Security Minister, Ben-Gvir, posted on social media as he taunted Marwan Barghouti, right? So he goes into the prison and he taunts him. And you see what he says there: "You won't win. Whoever messes with the nation of Israel, whoever murders our children and women, we will erase you," right? And he does that. The reason for that visit is so he can put it up on social media. And the minister for prisons is beside him when he does this. He's going into a prison to taunt a prisoner, like, as a minister. It's bonkers. Like, it is bonkers. Like, that could be happening in a state. I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think there's something interesting politically and sociologically happening with all of that stuff. I'll come back to that. So I promised Pater I would do something on the death penalty, because it's so topical as well. I'm very conscious again I'm ripping off other people's work here. In particular, I'm ripping off the work of my friend and colleague Ron Dudayi, who's a visitor, who's an Israeli human rights activist, who's a visitor at Queen's at the minute, and he was involved in the NGO coordination against the death penalty, which failed. But there was a lot of work went in between Palestinian NGOs and Israeli NGOs attempting to mobilise against the death penalty. So I'll just explain a bit about that. So the death penalty was abolished in Israel in 1954. There's only been one, now I'll come back to execution, what an execution means, but there has only been one formal execution, which was Eichmann in 1962, and in effect Israel has had a de facto abolitionist stance. It stayed on the books, but there were frequent efforts to bring it back in by the used to say the hard right in Israel. It's kind of the insane right and the hard right and the extreme right. That there's politics is kind of falling off the right cliff, so it's hard to find the right language. But anyway, there would be periodic efforts by the extreme right in Israel to bring it back in for terrorism, inverted commas, and those have all historically failed. And often the people making the arguments against the reintroduction of the death penalty would be the security leaders within the Israeli state. You know, it would be military leaders or people within the security industry, you know, saying this is a bad idea. If people are willing to martyr themselves, what is the deterrent purpose? What is the deterrent purpose of the death penalty? Right. So that would always have been the, inverted commas, pragmatic argument from the security establishment within Israel against it. So the current legislation passed the Knesset 62-48 a few weeks ago. It was really very interesting watching that. My friend Ron and I were watching it live as it was happening, because one of the things that, Netanyahu often doesn't want to be at the scene of the crime politically, and he was under a lot of significant pressure from the Germans, from the European Union and others around this, and so he often doesn't show up for crucial votes like this. So he's not filmed there and so forth. And so some on the right said, unless Netanyahu shows up, we're going to vote against. So so it could have gone anyway. It went through, and at the moment the NGOs are involved in taking a case to the Israeli Supreme Court to see whether or not it'll happen. But this is what I wanted to come back to. So as Pat said, the law is explicitly discriminatory. It applies only to Palestinians. So regardless the nature of an Israeli offence, and I think some of the activists were looking at, the worst child murderer in Israel or that kind of stuff, looking to find horrible extreme examples of Israeli ordinary violence, never mind political violence or settler, but just ordinary horrific violence to make the argument. It is explicitly discriminatory. It applies to the Palestinian community. The law has narrowed the space for judicial intervention, right? It is, so one of the legal arguments that you would hope the Supreme Court would take seriously, the Israeli Supreme Court would take seriously, is that it is cutting across judges. It is cutting across judicial space for interventions. There is an explicit prohibition, I kid you not, there is an explicit prohibition within the law trying to narrow the space for appeals within the army system. So in the military courts, ultimately you can appeal to the head of the army. The right in Israel were worried that the head of the Israeli IDF might be too liberal. I kid you not. And so they wanted to narrow that appeal process for going up to the head of the army. So you see Ben Gvir here. I don't know if you can see the picture of him at the top. He's got a wee noose thing on his lapel there. Like, it's kind of vile. And then when the law passed, he brought champagne into the Knesset. I mean, anyway, there's something quite interesting happening politically and sociologically there, which is a celebration by the extreme stroke insane right in Israel about the capture of the state and about the capture of the law. That's what's interesting there. Because you think about, why do they need to do this? You're already involved in a genocide. Why do you need to have legalized executions? And part of it is, on the extreme right, to celebrate, we have captured the state and we have captured the law. Because on the extreme right, and I interviewed some extreme right settlers, on the extreme right, they have seen the state in Israel as overly secular and at times resisting mad stuff. I interviewed an attorney general in the Israeli system. My project was called Cause Lawyers. Cause lawyers are lawyers who believe in a cause, right? And so, by definition, most of the lawyers I was interviewing around, we were in 6 or 7 different countries, were on the left. And so I said to our local organisers in Israel, I said, I want to interview some right-wing ones. I want to interview, and then one of my colleagues came back and said, there's an attorney general within the Israeli state who wants you to interview him. I said, fine, okay. I said, but he's working for the state. He said, yeah, he's a 30-year official working for the state. So and I said, okay. So did the interview in Jerusalem, and I said, so tell me this, you've been a state lawyer all your life. Why are you a cause lawyer? What's your cause? And he said, well, I expected him to say, well, my cause is to uphold the rule of law. You know, that's what most lawyers will say. My cause. He said, my cause is to stop even madder shit from happening. Even madder shit. See, he regarded him, now he's now retired. But, so what he's doing there with the champagne is celebrating state capture by the extreme stroke fascist right. Celebrating capture of the law. The law itself has an allure. Even though you are a state involved in a genocide, the law itself has an allure. Legalized judicial execution is one more ratcheting up of performative cruelty. That's what he's celebrating. I'll finish on this. I've been working for years on denial, on the ways in which states deny human rights violations. I was very influenced by a man called Stan Cohen. Stan Cohen is a very famous sociologist, and he was South African, left-wing South African, Jewish obviously. He went to Israel for a while, and he just became astonished by the ways in which Israeli society denied the reality of the occupation, denied human rights violations, and he theorized about it. It's really super clever stuff. So any of us who work in the human rights world know this. His work is kind of iconic around this, right? But we are no longer in the process of denial in Israel. We are in the process of celebration. This is the celebration of cruelty. Human rights violations, extreme human rights violations, have become a symbol of racist supremacy and political virility on the right in Israel. As Pat was talking about, and as everybody in this room knows, where you have repression against political prisoners, you will have resistance. People will resist repression. And the prisoners are often the broader social and political symbol of exactly that resistance, both locally but also internationally, as Pat was talking about. And one of the things, certainly when I was doing my own PhD work, to just see how much international solidarity there was for Pat and his colleagues internationally, what a high profile the first and second hunger strikes had, and how important that was. When I interviewed prisoners themselves, many of you will know this, how important it was to know and to feel like you weren't alone, like that people actually out in the world cared about you, that there was something there. So my final point is, when I first went to Palestine in 1994, I interviewed one Palestinian leader, and I said to him, first question, it was the same question we were asking everybody around prisoner release, and I said, how important are the prisoners in terms of the broader process in Palestine? And he said, first the land, then the prisoners. Thank you.
Powerful stuff. We now have Dr. Azadeh Sabu, Iranian-born academic. Thank you.
Jigadej, Agus, Salamun alaikum. اسمش آزاده is as Iran me. Gurmaigat for having me today, and Gurmaigat to Pader for the invitation. Same as you, Karen, I said I'm neither a political prisoner nor Palestinian, so why are you inviting me to this panel? But I hope to be able to honor the invitation. Since October 2023, 700 Palestinian women have been detained, university students, teachers, doctors, lawyers, and journalists. At times, women have been taken as hostages to make a father surrender or a brother to appear. As of now, 72 Palestinian women are held in Damon prison. 32 of them are mothers. Their 130 children cannot reach them. Among them, there are 3 women with cancer, and 17 are held without charge or trial. This is not a consequence of genocide. This is its method. Because genocide is not only about killing. It is temporal. It is about one generation being prevented from handing to the next. Memory, care, and the future itself. There is a genocide that is happening, which is rarely discussed. The genocide taking place inside Israeli jail. And here I am standing today to honor our Palestinian sisters in Israeli prison. For the 32 mothers in Damon, for their 130 children, and for the future they are still carrying. Systematic imprisonment is one of the primary mechanisms through which the occupying colonial power seeks to dominate the indigenous Palestinians. Testimonies from inside Israeli detention camps reveal not only physical violence, beating, deprivation, and psychological abuse, but a deeper logic of dehumanization. Detainees describe being stripped, blindfolded, and denied even the most basic necessities. Sahar Francis, Palestinian human rights lawyer, speaks about her recent visit of Israeli prisons. She says, I quote, "I don't even have words to describe how I felt when I started to visit the Gazan prisoners after the genocide and the level of humiliation, the level of abuse, the sexual harassment, the daily physical attacks, and the starvation. Red Cross committee is not allowed. The families are not allowed. And the prison guards are continuing with the policies of keeping the detainees just with one pair of clothes in the cell. They take the mattresses 5 in the morning till 11 in the evening. And they force the detainees to sit on the ground or in the iron bed under starvation. But it is not just about the starvation alone. It is the whole context of dehumanization for these detainees. So it comes along with the fact that they are not allowed to shower every day. They are not allowed to change their clothes every day. So after 1 month, they start to develop the very serious skin diseases, while also being starved. Sahar Francis explains she has met detainees with scabies, that they couldn't sit for even 5 minutes on the chair in the visit room. But you know, I have never thought about the consequences of not being able to use the toilet paper properly every day. This is one of the methods of the torture that Israeli authorities prevent toilet papers from the detainees and force them to go to the toilet without being able to clean themselves. And how they will suffer. And same goes with not providing women with sanitary towels, and what will happen if they are kept in detention for several months in that condition. The testimonies of doctors and medical staff released from Israeli prison speaks of severe deprivation, But the horror lies not only in the indescribable nature of the torture, but in the deliberate tactics employed by the occupying force to strip Palestinians of their humanity. In one account, a doctor describes how Palestinian prisoners are forced, in order to drink water, to kneel on the floor and drink from the same container used by dogs. Palestinian detainees report that before October 7, they used to have some kind of life inside the prison. They used to teach each other, they used to do some collective activities, but after October 7th, the time has stopped. No light, they say, nothing, no education, no food. It's only continuous torturing. The international society has failed the Palestinian people, and especially the prisoners in such a genocidal time, not being able to protect and to stop all those crimes and the daily serious violations. More than 89 detainees have died already in detention, including 1 child, for the first time ever since the beginning of the Israeli occupation. Yet, the media headlines often describe Israeli hostages exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. They call the soldiers of an occupying force participated in the genocidal ethnic cleansing of an indigenous people hostages. Yet they call the abducted Palestinian doctors, writers, journalists, aid workers, women and children prisoners. Since 1967, thousands of Palestinian women have been detained for political activity, protest, resistance, or as hostages. The prisoners' movement is not about resistance inside prison only, but also about how imprisonment restructures entire social world, with Palestinian women at the center of absorbing, sustaining, and transforming its effects. The prisoner movement is not marginal. It is central to Palestinian political life. It shapes public consciousness, national unity, and resistance strategies. In Palestine, there is no family without a prisoner. There is no family whose life has not been shaped by the prison system. Only by understanding this lived oppression can one grasp why the liberation of Palestinian prisoners and the collective sense of responsibility toward them has been the center of the Al-Aqsa flood operation on October 7th. I would argue, to understand the Israeli prison, we need to move beyond seeing prison as a site of punishment and instead recognize it as a system that organizes social life. Prison governs not only those it confines, but entire communities through the constant possibility of arrest, the removal of individuals, and the restructuring of families around absence and uncertainty. Its reach extends beyond prison wall into checkpoints, permits, and surveillance, forming a distributed carceral landscape. It governs time by delaying and interrupting life trajectories, and it governs labor by extracting value from those it confines. Women, in particular, stand at the center of the system. They are the ones who sustain families, absorb its pressures, and transform endurance into resistance. In this way, prison becomes not merely an institution, but a central mechanism through which power is exercised and society is shaped. The prison system under Israeli apartheid is central to sustaining a settler colonial state, not merely as a site of occupation, but as a mechanism for controlling land, managing the indigenous population, suppressing resistance, and reorganizing everyday life to ensure long-term dominance. The prison is not only where the settler colonial state punishes, it is how it endures. Over the years, Palestinian women prisoners have organized to defend their rights and carry out protests, giving birth to a structured movement. This movement has also developed more autonomously, tied to the specific condition of women's imprisonment. Inside prisons, Palestinian women have organized collectively, educated one another, built political consciousness, and resisted prison conditions by transforming the prison into a counter space of learning and solidarity. They have developed literacy programs, sustained political discussions, and cultivated forms of collective struggle. The struggle of Palestinian women within the prison system has always been closely linked to the national liberation struggle. Palestinian women prisoners resist both colonial domination and patriarchal marginalization inside prison and within the broader national movement. This dual struggle is important. Palestinian feminist scholar and researcher Dalal Bajes talks about the concept of colonial captivity. She explains how Palestinian life is governed not only through prisons, but through a broader system that structures space, movement, relationships, and intimacy. She argues that prison is not merely a site of confinement, but part of a wider regime that transforms everyday life itself into a condition of captivity. She says, law is used not to guarantee rights, but to legitimize control. I would like to conclude my speech by giving a tribute to Aisha Ode. Aisha Ode was the first female prisoner who was sent to Ramle prison in 1970s. She was a militant and fighter in the ranks of the Palestinian left-wing resistance. She was sentenced to 2 life sentences. She spent 10 years in Zionist prison before being released in 1979 as part of a prisoners' exchange. Aisha Ode is one of the most inspiring women I know. In her book, At the Cost of the Sun, she writes about her imprisonment following her resistance work during the 1960s and 70s. She says, "Often we dreamed of a free country where we could move freely along its shores without being strangers. No glitter of gold or sparkle of ornament distracted us. We felt ourselves extending beyond our own skins, covering the land of the whole homeland, not just the Arab land, but the entire globe. We would enter the souls of all people and create a new, beautiful world, and before all that, a free world. Was that selfish of me when I wished to be the homeland and the cause? Was that something selfish of me when I wished to be the homeland and the cause? Was that something that could not coexist with individual projects of a husband and children? My project was to build a homeland, not just a house. It was the project of my life, a project of a people, instead of a number of children whose freedom and lives are not guaranteed under occupation. In short, they were vast, wide, and great dreams that made difficulties easier along the way. We used to always repeat, if I do not burn, and you do not burn, then who will bring the light? Gormayagat.
Gormayagat to yourself. I don't know about the rest of you, but we need to hear these stories, and yet very uncomfortable at hearing what we do here. But thank you for letting us know what you've told us. Next we have Breeze Nicannon, a Belfast lady who is going to talk to us about trauma, not only in individuals but within communities. And thank you, Breeze. Okay.
Morna maine di tami inta sas de vehent seo livse mar an hour inta tauchter. So I'm very pleased to be here, although wrecked with nerves, I can tell you. But anyway, here I am. So I learned a new word the other day. Just following on from the last contribution, I learned a new word the other day when I was watching a video on Palestinian women prisoners. And the word I learned, and I hope I'm saying it correctly, is ashla. And ashla has been taken up from the Palestinian women, feminist writers, and so on. And what it means, it describes severed limbs, dismembered flesh, and scattered body parts created by the Israeli bombings. It is used to understand that not only does Zionism want to eliminate Palestinians, they want to evict the already dead from humanity, and prevent both Palestinians and Palestine from being whole. And when I learned that word, I was trying to find one word that would describe how I understand what's happening there. And ashla, of course, the language of the people, give the word that's necessary. So I just wanted to share that with you, because when we talk about the impact of trauma, we're talking about how that contributes to ashla. So I became a psychotherapist purely by accident. I'm an accidental psychotherapist. As a political activist, I was always interested and always involved in stuff around why do people collude with their oppressors? When I'm thinking about trauma, it's not a word I use very often because it has been popularized almost out of its use. Trauma is the experience of thinking at this moment, not thinking, but experiencing at this moment that you're going to die. So trauma gets thrown around as if it's like quite a flippant way of talking about things that are slightly disturbing or maybe even very disturbing. Excuse me. But it's not a death threat. So when we think about trauma, we think about the diagnosis that people use to decide who is traumatized, who is not, how severely they're traumatized, and so on, as a way of supposedly looking for support for mental health treatment. I did a mental health placement, and one notable psychiatrist that I won't name had no understanding at all of the role of community in the support of mental health. It was shocking. So this diagnosis if you want to read about the diagnosis of trauma, there's a really very good book called The Empire of Trauma. And in that book, basically what they're saying is, and including the work of the wonderful Judith Herman, that the trauma experience has always been political. Always been political. At the heart of all trauma is an oppressor and an oppressed, is a powerful and powerless. She says that when a traumatic event is of human origin, as psychotherapists, we cannot be bystanders. We have to choose the oppressed. We cannot be bystanders. In The Empire of Trauma, they outline very clearly how, trauma originated. Well, the first time we really talk about it in the 19th century, it was called hysteria. And of course, men didn't get it because they didn't have wombs. Women have hysters, so we get hysterical, but men can't do that. So, pretty strong statement. In the First World War, it was known as moral turpitude, and you could get shot for it. Or it was could be known as battle fatigue. Maybe didn't get shot for that. In the Second World War, it was known as battle neurosis or war neurosis, and the purpose of it was to patch people up and send them back to the front line. In the Vietnam War produced the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And they did so when the US troops came back from their defeat in Vietnam. The American state was very concerned about the 30,000 addicted soldiers and about the level of violence they had encountered and the level of violence that they had perpetrated against the Vietnamese, such as My Lai, the massacre at My Lai. So they put together all of the features that seemed to be common to people who had been in Vietnam. So the first thing that came out of the Vietnam War was the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. The second thing that came out of the war in Vietnam was the necessity for connection for recovery. The people who were addicted to hard drugs in Vietnam, the number was reduced to something about 7% when people got back to their families, to their connections, to their lives, to their histories, to their ancestors, to their future. In connection, they recovered. Nonetheless, the diagnosis became the important thing. Trauma happened to an individual. It created a condition that had to be fixed or cured, and done so by medication and sometimes individual therapy if it was available to you. And if you could prove that you were traumatized in this way, somehow you would have medical support. And what was left over and couldn't be cured was called post-traumatic stress disorder. The interesting thing that they say in The Empire of Trauma is that post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis follows American foreign policy. Where the Americans go, or where the US goes and causes the distress, then in the form of some NGOs, in the form of some finance being made available for reconstruction and so on and so forth, at the core of that is this diagnosis of PTSD. The thing about PTSD, which is so pernicious in these circumstances, is that it equalizes the injured and the perpetrator. The perpetrator can qualify as being subject to post-traumatic stress disorder, and so can the injured. The difference is the perpetrator has access to the systems of recovery. The injured do not. The perpetrator's reasons for creating the damage in the first place are obliterated. They're washed out. The diagnosis clears them. So there is no accountability, no responsibility, no nothing. On the other hand, The injured, as Father Wilson used to tell us here all the time, were always blamed for their own disaster. So I'm not arguing against post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. I'm simply saying it's limited. And Samar Jabber, who is a psychotherapist in Palestine, she was head of the Palestinian, she was head of the mental health department in the Palestinian Health Commission. She says Western diagnosis does not work in Palestine. It doesn't work. How do people survive continuous environmental death threat and actual death? How do people survive that? So I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who was at a conference of psychoanalysts, and there were a group of Palestinian people there, and one of the psychoanalysts was offering her support to train the Palestinians in mental health support. And one Palestinian said, "Go and train yourself," which I thought was a perfect answer. Go and train yourself. So in the optimistic and hopeful side of this is in the last 40 years, there has been a new approach to understanding trauma. And interestingly, it was born out of the NASA space project when they were trying to understand what happens to people's systems when they're so far away from home, when they're so not in control, and so on and so forth. And basically what emerged from that was trauma is not an event. Trauma doesn't happen as an event. Trauma happens in the residue that's left in your nervous system when the event is over. Why do we continue to behave as if we were on the point of death? And we do. We get hypervigilant, we develop all kinds of conditions, all kinds of behaviours. But the good thing about developing all of those kinds of behaviours and conditions, if there is a good side, the good side is that you survived, you're not dead. That's the good, and that's where we start. In the human DNA holds the capacity for recovery as an innate response to danger. So on the one hand, the threat comes towards you, it's too big, it's too much, it's too overpowering, it's too fast, it's too devastating. It pushes you beyond your capacity to cope. But the very fact that you're pushed beyond your capacity to cope means you have to do something different to survive. You develop a survival strategy. So rather than talk about PTSD as something that is limiting and distressing and all of that, much of it is. We talk about what was your survival strategy? How did you keep going? What kept you alive? What is still keeping you alive? What about that is still useful for you? What about that is not useful? And this has changed the whole understanding of traumatic responses as a mental health condition. They are not, it is not a mental health condition. If it has been left unattended, it can become a mental health condition. It can become a physiological condition, a medical condition. But that is in the absence of the means of recovery. It doesn't have to be there. As Peter Levine says, trauma is a fact of life. It does not have to be a life sentence. And most of the systems of recovery, certainly in the West, leave access to the means of recovery beyond the reach of the vast majority of people. So we're chasing behind the effect. When we're thinking about how this works in the nature of continuous struggle, continuous danger, we have to understand that safety, as we call safety, which is a key element of the diagnosis, you must have safety. Safety is not a thing. Safety is a continuous process of having your competence available to you in the world, regardless of what is thrown at you. And we get our safety from each other. We don't get it from inside, we get it from each other. We have a system in our DNA that supports us to live in groups. That's why we can be empathic, sympathetic. That's why we can be in solidarity. That's why we can care. It's also why we can reject, not like, push away. It also allows us to be curious. And it's innate in our systems. So in supporting trauma recovery, we're looking at this innate process that we already have available. And it is strengthened, it's enhanced, it's embedded in our contact with each other. We don't do it alone. So when I think about Ashla, I'm thinking about what colonialism does. Colonialism just doesn't steal the land. It doesn't just steal the resources. It tries to steal your identity. It tries to steal who you are. It tries to steal your history, your ancestry, and your future. Think of the unchilding of the children. Think of the unchilding of the children. The Israeli government is trying to wipe Palestine off the face of the earth by forward paying the generations. We will kill the forthcoming generations. So there will be no future Palestine. And in the education system and everywhere else, there will be no existing Palestine. When I was in Nazareth, I met a woman who ran a project in Nazareth for the children of Nazareth. And her project was writing children's books, children writing children's books under the title of I'm a Palestinian. Because the education system denies the right of Palestine to exist in the minds of children. So the colonizer wants to steal who we are as people. And this goes as far back as John Davies, who was the architect of the plantation of Ulster when he wrote to the British Crown, saying, and I just want to get his quote absolutely correct so that it will stay in your minds, and you'll never forget it, if I can just find it. Hang on. Yep. He said, "We may conceive of a hope that the next generation in tongue and heart and every way else becomes English, so as there will be no difference or distinction but the Irish Sea betwixt us." He became the Governor-General here in Ireland. His plantation plan went with the British Empire everywhere it went in the world, and that was the backbone of the identity-stealing aspect of British imperialism. A couple of years ago in the Knesset, I was reading the echo of John Davies. I can't remember who it was, but I remember that it was a woman in the Knesset. And she said, when she was asked what were Palestinians going to do, and she says, well, Palestinians can be killed, or they can go to another country if they'll take them. But in the new state, they can live quietly, but not as Palestinians. The colonizer wants to dehumanize us, and dehumanization is the work of the psychotherapist. It is the work of mental health specialists in conjunction with the community, with the people who live amongst us, people who are with us, people who understand us, people who recognize us as human. Mohammed El-Kurd, in his amazing book, Perfect Victims, if you haven't read it, it is an essential read. You'll be reading about us when you're reading that book. And he talks about dehumanization. He says, when I speak of dehumanization, I am referring to the West's refusal to look us in the eye. As a psychotherapist, I can only work in this context. There is no other way to work. Part of the recovery that people need from other human beings is recognition, is witnessing, is solidarity. For me as a psychotherapist, I have to be aware that I must be involved in active witnessing. Therefore, I refuse to eliminate politics from psychotherapy. I refuse. I think we have to always pay attention to Palestine because we can connect with each other in our innate experience of being human. We connect with each other. When we are connecting with Palestine, we are connecting directly to Palestine through being in the human race. We can't turn our eyes away. We can't leave it alone. And we cannot turn our eyes away because trauma isolates you. It leaves you outside the human race. It leaves you like you'll never be the same again. It leaves you terrified. When we're in solidarity with Palestinians and when we keep our eyes and our actions on Palestine, the Israelis cannot ignore us. The Israelis cannot ignore the support for Palestine. They cannot isolate Palestine in the way they want to. Gora míle maith.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Bridge. The last speaker we have now before the ambassador will be a poet and academic, Yusuf. Are you okay, Yusuf? Okay, thank you, Yusuf Almal. And he will, come on ahead, and he will talk here about his friend who is also a poet and refer to Gaza, okay?
Thank you very much. I know there have been long speeches before me, so I hope that you're not bored. I'm here to tell stories, the stories of the people of Palestine, the stories of the people of Gaza. This is a tradition the late Palestinian intellectual Rifat al-Ar'ir started, and many of you are familiar with the poem, If I Must Die, that is painted on the international wall in Belfast, that was written by him and that went viral after he was murdered by Israel. Rifat was my mentor, teacher, and over the years we became friends, we traveled together, and we promoted writings out of Gaza. There was a reputation about Rifat in the English language department that he was very tough, so many students avoided his classes. The number of students who got A's in his classes, however, was always higher than the number of students who failed his classes. But students who failed classes always complained about his style of teaching. But he described that style of teaching as tough love. He wanted his students to become the best version of themselves. He wanted them to believe in themselves and to tell their stories, because storytelling is an act of resistance, is an act of courage, is an act of keeping the memory alive when there is a war of erosion. Part of Israel's war against Palestinians is a war of erosion. Israel wants to see Palestine without Palestinians and Gaza without Gazans. And this has been their goal since day one. In 1969, there was a secret plan introduced by Moshe Dayan in Gaza to send 10,000 young people on a one-way ticket to Latin America. And this was before Hamas, and before October 7, and before the first or second intifadas. They never wanted Palestinians in Palestine. The size of the Gaza Strip has been shrinking over the years. In 1948, it was 555 kilometers. Then Israel created a buffer zone, demilitarized zone, because they called Palestinian refugees who tried to go back to their towns and villages. And 70% of the people of Gaza, including my family, are refugees. Infiltrators. And over the years, they annexed this buffer zone. It became part of the Gaza envelope, part of Israel today. And after October 7, 2023, they created another buffer zone. They occupy 60% of Gaza today. So Gaza has been shrinking. The population of Gaza has been increasing. In 1948, the population of Gaza jumped from 100,000 to 300,000 because of the mass exodus of Palestinian refugees. So this is our story. It's a story of refugees. And Rifat wanted to train a generation of Palestinians, as he said, an army of bloggers and writers who write in English about their hopes, their dreams, who tell their narrative and their side of the story. Because if you look at the mainstream media, you always find Palestinians as statistics in the best case scenario. They're always portrayed in a negative way, so Rifat wanted to challenge that. And as part of homework he gave to his students at the English language department, he asked them to write down their stories. He collected these stories and published them in a book called Gaza Writes Back, and he intentionally used the title Gaza Writes Back to imitate The Empire Writes Back. He also was global in his classroom, where he taught us about Malcolm X, Irish literature, English literature, American literature, Italian literature, Brazilian literature. So we were able to travel the world. Although we lived under siege in Gaza, we were confined to Gaza because of Israel's control of the borders, Israel's siege on Gaza, the maritime siege imposed on Gaza, inability to travel. It was always challenged at Rifat's classes and Rifat's books and pages. So we were able to see the world and connect with the world. He always wanted his students to travel outside Gaza, seek knowledge, and then come back. So he wanted us to tell our story. He always quoted this African proverb, until lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And in relation to Palestinian prisoners today, and today is Prisoners' Day, I have been involved in 3 books on Palestinian political prisoners: the Prisoners' Diaries, Palestinian Voices from the Israeli Gulag, that was published in 2013. 2016, another book came out on Palestinian child prisoners, Dreaming of Freedom, Palestinian Child Prisoners Speak. And in 2021, along with Danny Morrison, Asad Abu Sharh and Norma Hashim, a friend from Malaysia, we also published the stories of Palestinian and Irish hunger strikers in a book titled A Shared Struggle. It's sold out now, but we're working on printing more copies in the next few days and weeks. It's very important that we've seen statistics about Palestinian prisoners, 9,300 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. About 1,200 are from Gaza. 89 lost their lives under torture since October 7. There are 84 Palestinian women who are detained by Israel. There are about 3,500 Palestinians who are held without charge or trial. But it's important that we turn these statistics, numbers, figures into stories, because people connect to stories. And when they listen to stories, they remember them, and they say, this could be us, this could be our families. Teachers connect to teachers, doctors connect to doctors. Israel killed Palestinian Dr. Adnan al-Bursh under torture in Israeli jails. If we tell this story to doctors, they will connect. They will say, this could be us one day if we do not stand up for human rights in Palestine. Ayman al-Abbasi, a child prisoner who was detained by Israel, and when he was released, they shot him dead in Jerusalem in 2015. And not only this, they tried to kidnap his body. And his family and community had to literally smuggle his body to the graveyard, which meant that his family was not able to see him for the last time. These are our stories. The stories of torture coming out, CT Man, the notorious Israeli detention center, the story of Ibrahim Salim from Gaza, whose picture went viral. It was blurred. It was exposed by CNN crew who were not allowed into the detention center. He was raped. His ribs were broken. He was not given medical attention for a long time. And after 8 months, no charge, no trial, he was released into Gaza. But before that, Israel killed 3 of his siblings. They destroyed their home, and his children were critically injured, and he was in the intensive care unit at Kamal Udwan Hospital with his children. The Israeli military detained him from there. And they tried to tell him that his children died after he was detained. So they always do this to Palestinian political prisoners. If you look at the means of torture they use, they have a special room for music, loud music, a special room, air conditioning, where they splash Palestinian prisoners with cold water and then turn the air conditioning on. And that's why many Palestinian prisoners came out of prison with their legs amputated. They lost their ability to hear, and some of them became blind. This is the kind of torture that we're talking about. And this is the kind of stories we want to talk about. I know I have limited time, and you have listened to many figures and statistics today, but I am in Ireland to promote the book If I Must Die. And I want to tell you the story of the poem that you see on the wall, on the international wall, that was written by my mentor Rifat. We had a very interesting relationship, and Rifat was close to many of his students. He helped them financially, he donated books for them, he never charged them for classes he gave. And he pushed them to their limits in a positive way so that they become the best version of themselves, as I said. In 2011, he wrote the poem, If I Must Die, You Must Live to Tell My Story. And he was very prophetic in many different ways. He anticipated many things that happened later. There are people who refer to tweets he wrote 10 years ago, today, to explain some political situations. And the reason he was able to understand Israel's propaganda is because he studied this propaganda carefully. In fact, he translated a document, a secret document, that came out in 2009 titled The Israel Project Global Language Dictionary. And it teaches Israeli spokespeople who speak to Western audience basically how to lie and what to say about Jerusalem, about the wall, about Gaza, about Iran, about settlements, about the right of return. So Rifat understood the propaganda very well, and he started working on a Palestinian guide to be given to Palestinian journalists who speak to Western audience. But he lost his life before he was able to publish this guide. So again, he wrote the poem in 2011. Many people think that he wrote it a month before he was killed. That's not true. He penned the poem to his X account a month before he was murdered because he received a lot of threats. There were many politicians, army people in Israel, even like in the United States, journalists like Barry Weiss, who incited against Rifat. They carried out smear campaigns targeting him. It was a character assassination campaign that paved the way for his actual killing. So he felt that his life was coming to an end. He loved Gaza. He loved his hometown of Shuja'iyya. Everywhere he went to, he reminded people that he comes from Shuja'iyya. And I remember we were promoting Gaza Rights Back in New York City, and we visited the Brooklyn Bridge. Maybe some of you have been there. And he engraved the name of his town, Shuja'iyya, on the bridge. And he wrote Shuja'iyya, D.C., like Washington, D.C. He was very smart. He liked joking. He liked life. And he liked to joke, crack jokes everywhere he went to. So people remember him for his dark humor. Even during the genocide, people would ask about him. And he would come out with a tweet like joking. And people would ask him, how do you joke? He says, if you cannot change your life, mock it. He always repeated that. So he wanted to write one last story out of Gaza. And he pinned this poem to his account soon after he received a call from an Israeli intelligence officer telling him, "We know where you are and we will get you." That was because he was tweeting. And every day he would walk 25,000 steps a day so that he could get access to the internet and write a tweet out of Gaza. So he was very much committed to his work. And I've seen this in dozens of lectures he organized. He was always like carrying a book under his elbow and running to another lecture. So he was very busy, working multiple jobs a day. In fact, some of the students, he loved Shakespeare. This is another fun fact about him. Some students joke that he kept a copy of Macbeth under his pillow when he slept, and he would laugh to this joke. In fact, he encouraged his students to create memes about his teaching style, and some students started Facebook groups about his teaching style, and he was part of these groups. So he was fun to be around, but he was very tough. He was very mean with the grades, and he didn't joke around. If you take a course with him, you forget about your life, your social life, your friends, but you learn a lot. The poem was translated, so soon after he got the threats, he went to his sister's house, and once he got there, Israel targeted him, killing him and his sister and his brother, as well as 4 of his nephews and nieces. And once he was killed, a lot of you might be aware, the poem went viral. People started reciting the poem at rallies, protests. Rifat and I once stayed in the state of Georgia in the United States, and our host became a member of the local Congress. It was recited in the local Congress. It was recited in the Parliament of New Zealand. I've seen it at different places, like famous actors. It was translated into 400 languages. I would say it became the poem of the century. And to honor his life, I collected his writings, poetry and prose, in the book If I Must Die, that sold 70,000 copies now, and all the proceeds from this book go to his surviving family. This shows the impact of storytelling. Storytelling of our people, and prisoners are part and parcel of this narrative that we need to tell to the world about our struggle. Israel imprisons the best of our society, the elites, intellectuals, targets them, kills them. But as Rifat always repeated, Palestine is a story away. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Patricia McKeown is coming up here now to say a few words and introduce our main speaker.
You've heard a lot of speeches, but most important voices at these events are always the voices of the Palestinian people. I want to say a few words about the solidarity organisations that are represented in the room today, and there are a number of you, and each of us has our own really important task to support the Palestinian people in their struggle. Mine is the Irish Trade Union Movement, Trade Union Friends in Palestine. When I was listening to Breed, I thought, my God, what a two-hander there would have been between our co-founder, Eamon McMahon, and her on exactly that issue. And the very first time we took a delegation into Palestine, he immediately spotted the trauma in the Young Children's Centre that we'd been invited to see as a showcase of how Palestinian children, Israeli Arab children, because they're not allowed to be Palestinians, and Israeli children were being brought together, hands across the divide in a little nursery. What we saw was clearly the results of occupation, the settler colonial model at work, apartheid at work. It couldn't be hidden. It was all there in front of us. And For the last 21 years, Trade Union Friends of Palestine has been the solidarity wing of the Irish trade union movement. And I think it's very important that everybody recognises that we have the most extensive, comprehensive policy and action programme on Palestine of any trade union movement anywhere. And that is no coincidence. You've heard enough from many of our speakers about why it should be that we in the Irish trade union movement understand so very, very clearly what you have to do to stand up against settler colonialism and all that goes with it. But we take our main authority and instruction from the Palestinian people themselves. And we do that through the efforts that we try to make to implement the policy of the BDS movement. And the BDS movement covers everything we're talking about here, every aspect of the denial of the rights of the Palestinian people, including the Palestinian prisoners and including the right to return. And of course, most particularly, the ongoing genocide. So, look, Gramsci, 100 years ago, they threw Antonio Gramsci in prison, and he described the times as a time of monsters. And the political shape of the world may have altered a few times around the edges over the last 100 years, but we are living in a time of monsters. So there is an obligation on every one of us to do what we can to serve the cause of the Palestinian people. And I suppose if I was to think about the difference, and this may be the perception of having lived here in my own country, it seemed to me there was a bigger international spotlight on the plight of our political prisoners than there is on the plight of Palestinian prisoners to this day. So will the world revolt if they execute Marwan Barghouti? We have to make sure what we can do, what we can to stop it from happening. But what will the international reaction be? At the minute it's deep concern, we're told. I'm not sure what deep concern means, but it does not mean intervention in a genocide or in any of the hideous components that make up this settler colonial model, to which so much of the world is in fact wedded. The other prisoner, I know it's not right just to highlight individual prisoners, but there is no doubt that some of them attain iconic status, and that is important to the cause and the struggle as well. So I do want to bring attention to Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, who many of you will know was the medical director of one of the main hospitals in Gaza, and he has been in prison since 23. We know he's been tortured. We do not know what his current circumstances are. In the trade union movement and in Trade Union Friends of Palestine, we have kept very close contact with our colleagues. Most of them are today apparently terrorist organisations, such as the Dr. Mona Al-Farah in the Centre for the Defence of Children, the International Centre for the Defence of Children, or our friend Sharwan Jabareen, who is the director of Al-Haq, the human rights NGO in Palestine, another Israeli designated terrorist organisation, and of course our very close friend in Ireland, Raji Sourani, the director of the Centre for Palestinian Human Rights, which still exists, and not only exists but is still fighting the cause for Palestinian human rights on an international front. Sometimes we lose faith in the fact that it looks as though the rule of law is broken, and it doesn't matter anymore what international courts of human rights or international courts of justice have to say about genocide and all that goes with it. But I don't think we can accept that as the situation. I think we have to continue. We're doing what we can inside the Irish trade union movement, so I want to pay tribute to my colleagues like Conor McCarthy here, who continues to lead at workplace level, and particularly in the health service, spotlights on what's happening to our colleagues in the health services in the occupied territories and in Gaza, and a particular tribute to my colleague Kathleen Cahill, who has developed, alongside Omar Barghouti and the NGO McCann, a very powerful educational tool for the trade union movement to raise awareness of the BDS campaign and the role we all have to play in it, and has now delivered that to over 1,000 shop stewards across Ireland, across a whole range of unions. We have many more thousands to get through to. So that's, if you like, me doing a bit of an advert for Trade Union Friends of Palestine. I think there's no doubt about that, but I think it's important that we all continue to work together in solidarity. I was particularly happy in the Irish trade union movement when we were able to welcome our current ambassador, our Palestinian ambassador to Ireland. We go way back in the Irish trade union movement with Palestinian ambassadors. I think one of our most colourful was Youssef Allen. So the fact that Jilan Abdel-Majid has spoken so strongly and so clearly on behalf of the Palestinian people on this island, as well as on an international basis, gives me great pleasure to introduce her as the keynote speaker today. You are very, very welcome, Jilan.
Thank you very much. I don't think that I have left anything to add today, actually. Yes. Thank you very much. I mean, all the guest speakers, they fully covered the topic. It's not topic, but we have to talk about it. And I was while listening to them, I thought okay, I mean, they covered everything that I have included in my speech today, but I thought of something that might be new for me and for all the people since I became the ambassador of Palestine and I spoke in many events. It's my personal experience of having a prisoner in my own house, and the experience of have the night raid and arrest my brother. And this happened actually more than 30 years ago, when he was 17 and I was 19. That was, I don't know if it was a trauma, because I remember a few years working with the former ambassador, and during the same day, like the 17th of April, to remember and pay tribute to all our prisoners. And he was talking about it, and when we finished the event, I said, you know, Ambassador, my brother was arrested one day, and I was there at home when many soldiers raid the house and arrest him. And he spent a couple of years in the Israeli prison. One of them, because he was severely ill, he spent it in the hospital. And I start to remember these, that night when they came, I don't know how many of them, maybe 10, maybe 15, they raid around 2:30 at night and arrest him. And I remember the last thing that I told the soldier about, please don't hit him, don't beat him. And the minute that they put him in the jeep, we heard his screaming, and they left. Anyway, just this minute brought me back to this difficult experience. And I wanted to say something maybe after I had I will speak about the Prisoners' Day. A message from the son of Jihad Ja'ara. He's one of the Palestinians' deportees, the Bethlehem or the Church of Nativity. he sent it from his prison. He was jailed twice for 6 months. They renew it for another 6 months as an administrative detention. And the soldier, every time, when he come and talk to him, he tell him just to remind your father that he was one day when he was 13 years old, and we will continue to run after him even with his children. He has 4 children, and this one, Samad, he just was born the minute that he arrived to Ireland 22 years ago. So I will read part of the message that he wrote to his father while he was in the prison, so at least to make the things like, you know, different, like, because I know that many of the guest speakers really covered the matter. Sometimes the personal things touch the people, because this is how the Palestinians and every Palestinians really feel that one day he experienced to have one of his children, one of his sister, brothers, arrested by the Israelis and spent some time. I really would like to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak in this remarkable event to honor our Palestinian prisoners. I want to go back to 1974, and this day, the 17th of April, where the Palestinian National Council adopted a resolution to mark this day, to observe and pay a national tribute to all our prisoners and their sacrifice, and renew our call to unify the efforts to support them and their right to freedom, as well as to show solidarity with their families. Today and this day, every Palestinian remind themselves of all our prisoners who are being held captive in Israeli jails and subjected to all forms of physical and psychological abuse, including violent interrogations, unhygienic conditions, medical negligence, and acts of torture. Every Palestinian family has been directly or indirectly impacted by the Israelis' policy of mass detention. Michael, you asked me to cover a few points about the figures, and they are not numbers, actually. It's human beings who really suffered for so many years. And the most recent updated figures issued by the official Palestinian prisoners institutions give the latest number of the Palestinian political prisoners held by the Israel, by the occupation state. We have, at the minute, 9,600 Palestinian prisoners, among them 350 children under the age of 80, and out of these 350, 180 a child under administrative detention. And you know that the administrative detention is a detention that nobody gives you the reason, and the Israelis can go for 6 months and 6 months, and we have hundreds, actually the number exactly of the administrative detainees are 3,532 people held under this this detention, like, you know, the administrative detention, and this, as I said, like, you know, who are held without a trial or charge, without informing them of the nature and the cause of the charge, and denying them the right of a fair trial as well. All of these things, it's a war crimes. It's adding to the war crimes that Israel committing every day against the Palestinian people. I wanted to say as well, you asked me about like, you know, how many people actually from the health workers have been detained. After the 7th of October, Israel detained 23,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and thousands in Gaza. Maybe the number is not really very well known, but many of the credible Palestinian and international organizations, they put this number, it's 1,340 people from Gaza were arrested and detained in Gaza. Like Mr. Al-Jamal, he talks about the experience of the Palestinian detainees from Gaza. The number of the health workers that were killed is 360, like 741 health workers have been killed, and 360 were arrested. There are two different organizations who set the numbers, but the most credible one is the Relief Web, is an information service provided by UN OCHA, the Office of the Coordination of Human of humanitarian aid. They reported this, but this figure is by the end of 2025. The figures now, it's more than 1,000 Palestinian healthcare workers have been killed during the ongoing war on Gaza, and over 300 have been arrested, each with distinguished record of service and achievement. The list of those killed were compiled primarily, as I said, from lists published periodically by Palestinian Minister of Health and some other international organization. I wanted to talk first about the recent death penalty that was adopted by the Israeli Knesset, and I will just talk a little bit about it. This legislation is the first of its kind to explicitly expand the scope of the death penalty in an unprecedented manner, reopening the complex historical debate surrounding capital punishment dating back to the British Mandate period before the establishment of Israel. While the death penalty has not been fully abolished in Israel, it has remained effectively defunct for decades, with Israel carrying out only 2 judicial executions in its history, and I will talk later on. And furthermore, the law opens the door to unjustified legal double standard between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The two cases, the Israeli civilian judiciary demonstrates its exceptional relationship with the death penalty through only 2 cases in its modern history. And these 2 cases, one of them, the first, occurred during the Nakba, when the first executions in modern Israel took place after Meir Tobenaski, is an Israeli army officer, was accused of espionage and tried in a military court. The second cause is the trial of Adolf Eichmann. It's between 1961 and 1962, who was convicted of crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and executed on May 31, 1962. Additionally, in the mid of 1980s, Israel sentenced Ivan Dimajanosh-Juk to death, also accused of collaborating with the Nazi, before the sentence was overturned on appeal due to doubts about the identity. Actually, the first one, which called Meir, after his execution, they said that he wasn't guilty. Anyway, I go back to the penalty, to the death penalty, and tell you exactly what it is, not in details, but just in a very general idea. It stipulates the formation of 2 separate courts, a military court for Palestinians in the Palestinian territory occupied in 1967, and a civil court for the Palestinian in the Palestinian territories occupied in 1948. In these courts, prisoners convicted of carrying out operations that result in deaths of Israelis face the death penalty or life imprisonment, with the judge having discriminatory power, as you explained. So it will just, there is no way for the judge, to give an opportunity to say something. There are so many initiatives happening now between some Israeli lawyers and Europeans and others with the Palestinians from Israel, using this as a base to argue over the legality of this. But at the end of the day, this bill was passed. The people in Israel, especially Ben Gvir and who support him, they were celebrating champagne out of the parliament, as you explained it very well. They celebrate the cruelty. This law fundamentally, as I said, contradicts the obligation of the occupying power under international humanitarian law, constituting a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which prohibits the imposition of death penalty on protected persons in the occupied territory. It also violates additional protocol of 1977, the principle of non-discrimination and the right of life enshrined in the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and other international conventions. Before I conclude, I just want to point out to two important reports released just recently. One is by the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, called Another Genocide Behind the Walls, and the other report by the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. The Euromed report relied primarily on the life testimonies from Palestinians, former detainees from the Gaza Strip who were released by the Israeli occupation forces in recent weeks and months, and who reported being subjected to various forms of systematic sexual violence. The report highlights that the Israeli torture system deliberately widened the circle of harm through strategy of psychological warfare that exploit the high value placed on dignity and privacy. The Palestinian collective Palestinian collective consciousness, turning them from protective norms into instrument correction. Francesca Albanese, as well, as I said, the UN Special Rapporteur, has published a report, Torture and Genocide, documents the torture that is inflicted upon Palestinians in Israeli prisons. In her conclusion, she states, in custody, the Palestinian captive have been subjected to exceptionally ruthless physical and psychological abuse. She continued, these practices demonstrate that the detention system of Israel has descended into a regime of systematic and widespread humiliation and terror aimed at stripping the Palestinians not only their liberty, but of their dignity, identity, and even the most basic sense of humanity. Far from isolated excesses, such conduct has been institutionalized within detention structures politically endorsed by Israeli authorities and publicly justified or even celebrated by segments of society. And we witnessed this, as I said, after the death penalty. Albanese continues, and why I mentioned and I stress on this, because these UN reports are, like, for the whole world to see and realize what exactly. Yes, I can say something. People from Gaza can say something, from the West Bank, from the Palestinians in 1948, their experience. But when this voiced in UN reports and UN representative, that makes difference. And I hope that there will be action that being taken, regardless all these violations and breaches of international law, that Israel continue to act with impunity. I wanted just to point out to the last part of this report of Albanese. Any credible pursuit of justice must confront torture not as isolated crime, but as a foundational pillar of a genocidal project aimed at the complete erasure of physical and psychological destruction, displacement, and replacement of the Palestinian people. Today, in this day, the 17th of April every year, the Palestinians around the world not only mentioned the prisoners. And as you said, like, you know, the two words that this lady talked about, or the Palestinians, that means for the Palestinians, land and prisoners. The land, it's because we're deeply rooted in the land, and we belong to Palestine, and we will never give up our rights in Palestine. And the prisoners, or the freedom fighters, as our friends here in Ireland call them, they are the people who pay their souls to let someone like me stand up here today and talk about the plights of the Palestinian people. These are the people who sacrifice everything to let me represent the Palestinian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Paul Maskey, MP for West Belfast, would like to present you with just a little token of thank you. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Ambassador. It's just this one. I don't want to go over you. Here. Thank you. And that's an honorary membership with this, our premises. Okay. Thank you.
John,
Thanks, Paul, for
we are your honorary membership.
Hunter.